Namaskar. Well, friends, I heartily welcome you all to Bhim Bhashya, my audio visual podcast series on Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar. This audio video podcast series has 54 short speeches on Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar, unraveling as many as 25 different dimensions of this multifaceted genius. Friends, this podcast series is focused on Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar, his thoughts, his actions, his philosophy, and most importantly, the kind of vision that he has seen for the nation as a whole. That is what this podcast series is all about. So let's proceed. Well, friends, let's continue our discussion of the historic role played by Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar as the principal architect of the Indian Constitution. In this episode 45, I'm going to talk about Dr. Ambedkar's presentation of the final draft of the Indian Constitution to the Constituent Assembly on November 25, 1949, which was approved the very next day, November 26, 1949, and precisely 2 months later, India became republic. First, let us understand the historical backdrop. The drafting committee for the Constitution of India was elected by the Constituent Assembly on August 29, 1947. And beginning from August 30th, 1947, the drafting committee was engaged in the preparation of the draft constitution under the chairmanship of Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar. The first draft, as we discussed in the last two episodes, was presented to the Constituent Assembly on 4th November 1948, and it contained 315 articles and 8 schedules. Over the next 13 months, Constituent Assembly went through 3 readings of the draft constitution, discussing and adopting the articles of constitution one by one. While replying to the debate during the third and the final reading of the constitution on November 25th, 1949, Dr. Ambedkar made an eloquent and spellbinding speech which is truly timeless. Among other things, Dr. Ambedkar said, and I quote him, "Looking back on the work of the Constituent Assembly, it will now be 2 years, 11 months, and 17 days since we first met on December 9, 1946. During this period, the Constituent Assembly has altogether held 11 sessions. Out of these 11 sessions, the first 6 were spent in passing the objectives resolution and consideration of the reports of committees on fundamental rights, on union constitution, on union powers, on provincial constitution, on minorities, and on the scheduled areas and scheduled tribes. The 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th, and 11th, these sessions were devoted to the consideration of the draft constitution. These 11 sessions of the Constituent Assembly have consumed 165 days, and out of these, the Assembly spent 114 days for the consideration of the draft constitution. When the draft constitution was presented to the Constituent Assembly, in all, 7,635 amendments were tabled, of which 2,473 amendments were actually moved in the House. And Dr. Ambedkar performed a Herculean task of building consensus and defending the draft constitution. You can imagine this was a group of 295 or about 300 people, the best minds in the country, talking about the future of the country. And Dr. Ambedkar single handedly did the job of building consensus among this elite and the intellectual cream of the Indian society at that time. Now, that is no doubt an Herculean task which only Dr. Ambedkar could complete. In its final form, the draft constitution contained 395 articles and 8 schedules. What I'm going to talk about here is part of the presentation that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar made to the Constituent Assembly regarding the final draft of the Indian Constitution. Then Dr. Ambedkar added, and I quote, "I mention these facts because at one stage it was being said that the Assembly had taken too long a time to finish its work, that it was going on leisurely and wasting public money. It was said to be a case of Nero fiddling while Rome was burning. Is there any justification for the complaint? Let us note that the time consumed by constituent assemblies in other countries appointed for framing their constitutions. To take few illustrations, United States took 4 months in 1787. Canada took 2 years and 5 months in the year 1864. Australia took 9 years in the year 1891. And South Africa took 1 year in the year 1908. It is true that we have taken more time than what the Americans and South Africans did, but we have not taken more time than the Canadian Convention and much less than the Australian Convention. In making comparisons on the basis of the time consumed, two things must be remembered. One thing is that constitutions of America, Canada, South Africa and Australia are much smaller than Indian Constitution. Our Constitution contains 395 articles, while the American Constitution has just 7 articles. The Canadian has 147, Australia has 127, and South Africans have 153 sections. The second thing to be remembered is that the makers of the constitutions of America, Canada, Australia, and South Africa did not have to face the problem of amendments. They were passed as moved. On the other hand, this Constituent Assembly had to deal with as many as 2,473 amendments. Having regard to these facts, the charge of dilatoriness seems to me quite unfounded, and this Assembly may well congratulate itself for having accomplished so formidable a task in so short a time. Then Dr. Ambedkar went on to give credit, to profusely thank all his colleagues. He gave a lot of credit to Sir B.N. Rao, who was the constitutional advisor to the Constituent Assembly, Mr. S.N. Mukherjee, the chief draftsman of the Constitution. Then he also gave a lot of credit to the members of the staff working with Mr. Mukherjee. Then Dr. Ambedkar thanked the Congress party, which brought into proceedings a sense of order and discipline. Finally, he thanked all the members of the Constituent Assembly and, of course, the President of the Constituent Assembly for the way in which he had conducted the proceedings of the Assembly. Then Dr. Ambedkar proceeds, and I quote him, "I shall not enter into the merits of the Constitution because I feel, however good a Constitution may be, it is sure to turn out bad because those who are called to work it happen to be a bad lot. However bad a constitution may be, it may turn out to be good if those who are called to work it happen to be a good lot. The working of a constitution does not depend wholly upon the nature of the constitution. Dr. Ambedkar went on, and I quote him again, "There is only one point of constitutional import to which I propose to make a reference. A serious complaint is made on the ground that there is too much of centralization and that states have been reduced to municipalities. It is clear that this view is not only an exaggeration but is also founded on a misunderstanding of what exactly the Constitution contrives to do. The basic principle of federalism is that the legislative and executive authority is partitioned between the center and states, not by any law to be made by the center, but by the Constitution itself. This is what Constitution does. The states under our Constitution are in no way dependent upon the center for their legislative or executive authority. The center and the states are co-equal in this matter. It is difficult to see how such a constitution can be called centralism. The first charge of centralization, defeating federalism, must therefore fall. The second charge is that the center has been given the power to override the states. The charge must be admitted. But before condemning the Constitution for containing such overriding powers, certain considerations must be borne in mind. The first one is that these overriding powers do not form the normal feature of the Constitution. Their use and operation are expressly confined to emergencies only. The second consideration is, could we avoid giving overriding powers to the center when an emergency has arisen? Those who do not admit the justification for such overriding powers to the center, even in emergency, do not seem to have a clear idea of the problem which lies at the root of the matter. There can be no doubt that in the opinion of the vast majority of people, the residual loyalty of the citizen in an emergency must be to the center and not the constituent states. For it is only the center which can work for a common end and for the general interests of the country as a whole. Herein lies the justification for giving the center certain overriding powers to be used in an emergency. Here, Dr. Ambedkar says, here I could have ended, but my mind is so full of the future of our country that I feel I ought to take this occasion to give expression to some of my reflections thereon. On January 26, 1950, India will be an independent country. What would happen to her independence? Will she maintain her independence or will she lose it again? This is the first thought that comes to my mind. It is not that India was never an independent country. The point is that she once lost the independence she had. Will she lose it a second time? It is this thought which makes me most anxious for the future. What perturbs me greatly is the fact that not only India has once before lost her independence, but she lost it by the infidelity and treachery of some of her own people. Dr. Ambedkar then gives examples of a lot of people, including Jai Chand and others, and then raises a question, and I quote him: "Will history repeat itself? It is this thought which fills me with anxiety. This anxiety is deepened by the realization of the fact that in addition to our enemies in the form of caste and creeds, we are going to have many political parties with diverse and opposing political creeds. Will Indians place the country above their creed, or will they place the creed above the country? I do not know, but this much is certain, that if the parties placed creed above the country, our independence will be put in jeopardy for a second time and probably be lost forever. This eventuality, which we must all resolutely guard against, we must be determined to defend our independence with the last drop of our blood." Dr. Ambedkar went on to add, and I quote him again, "On January 26, 1950, we are going to enter into a life of contradiction. In politics, we'll have equality, and in social and economic life, we will have inequality. In politics, we will be recognizing the principle of one man, one vote, and one vote, one value. In our social and economic life, we shall, by the reason of our social and economic structure, continue to deny the principle of one man, one value. How long shall we continue to live this life of contradictions? How long shall we continue to deny equality in our social and economic life? If we continue to deny it for long, we will do so only by putting our political democracy at peril. We must remove this contradiction at the earliest possible moment, or else those who suffer from the inequality will blow up the structure of political democracy which this Constituent Assembly has so laboriously built up." Unquote. Dr. Ambedkar added, and I quote him again, "The second thing we are wanting in recognition of the principle of fraternity." What does fraternity mean? Fraternity means a sense of common brotherhood for all Indians. It is the principle which gives unity and solidarity to social life. It is a difficult thing to achieve. Finally, Dr. Ambedkar says, and I quote him, "Independence is no doubt a matter of joy, but let us not forget that this independence has thrown on us great responsibilities. By independence, we have lost the excuse of blaming the British for anything going wrong. If hereafter things go wrong, we will have nobody to blame except ourselves. There is a great danger of things going wrong. Times are changing fast. People, including our own, are being moved by new ideologies. They are getting tired of government of the people. They are prepared to have government for the people and are indifferent whether it is the government of the people and by the people. If we wish to preserve the Constitution in which we have sought to enshrine the principle of government of the people, for the people, and by the people, let us resolve not to be tardy in the recognition of the evils that lie across our path and which induce people to prefer government for the people to government by the people, nor to be weak in our initiative to remove them. This is the only way to serve our country. I know no better. Unquote. This is where Dr. Ambedkar concluded his magnificent speech. I have only given you a part of that speech, not the whole. But this is the speech that made a lot of difference in the working of the Constituent Assembly. Let's now turn to the reaction to the Constitution, then and much later. While many people credit Dr. Ambedkar as the father of the Indian Constitution, even hailing him as a modern Manu after the legendary author of the Laws of Manu, Manusmriti, which ironically was put to fire by him in 1927. More recently, in a serious indictment of Dr. Ambedkar, Arun Shourie labeled him as the false Manu. Shourie's criticism of Dr. Ambedkar rests on 3 points. First, since the drafting committee was responsible only for shaping the articles drafted by the specialized subcommittees, whose suggestions were later discussed in the plenary sessions, Dr. Ambedkar could not have been in any position to influence the text of the Constitution. Secondly, the guidelines for each article were decided by the Congress Party, to which Dr. Ambedkar was not privy. Thirdly, Dr. Ambedkar found himself in a minority on numerous occasions in the subcommittees, the drafting committee, and during the plenary sessions. Well, friends, Arun Shourie's criticism of Dr. Ambedkar is blatantly false, besides being grossly unfair. In addition to being the chairman of the drafting committee, Dr. Ambedkar was a member of 2 committees, the advisory committee and the powers committee. In the former case, in fact, he was a member of 2 important subcommittees, the one on fundamental rights and also the one on rights of the minorities. Moreover, even where Dr. Ambedkar was not responsible for drafting the primary text, that is to say, preparing the first draft, as the chairman of the drafting committee, he was responsible for reformulating them in the form of articles for consideration of the Constituent Assembly. Furthermore, the Constituent Assembly discussed several drafts, and there were 3 readings of the draft, and each time, unmistakably, it was Dr. Ambedkar who, as the chairman of the drafting committee, took the lead in directing the discussion and firming up the formulations. This is called the piloting of the Constitution. Just imagine, Dr. Ambedkar was facing 295 or about 300 odd people, the most brilliant minds of that time. They were all there, all the intellectual cream, leaders from all walks of life. And Dr. Ambedkar defended every article. So it was not only drafting the Constitution, but taking each clause, by article, conducting the discussion on the either side, positive and negative, and then building a consensus among them. You can imagine, even in a housing society meeting on an issue like raising the salary of a liftman, people spend 3 hours debating that. Here, we were talking about the future of a great country like India, and 300 best minds were debating it. And the job of bringing about a consensus of views among all of them was truly an Herculean task, which only Dr. Ambedkar single-handedly achieved. Even those editorial tasks which were willy-nilly entrusted to Dr. Ambedkar on account of the chronic absenteeism of the drafting committee that the drafting committee was subjected to. As one of the members of the drafting committee, T.T. Krishnamachari, who later became the Finance Minister of India, admitted later, and I quote him, "So it happened ultimately that the burden of drafting this constitution fell on Dr. Ambedkar, and I have no doubt that we are grateful to him for achieving this task in a manner that is undoubtedly commendable." Unquote. Mr. Shourie was nowhere there at that time. Here we are listening from the person who was there in that committee, drafting committee, as a member, and one who witnessed that everything. He is the one who has made this statement. In this regard, the comment made by Dr. Rajendra Prasad, the chairman of the Constituent Assembly, is perhaps most illuminating. Again, he was there all the time. Mr. Shourie was nowhere. Dr. Rajendra Prasad said, and I quote, "Sitting in the chair and watching the proceedings from day to day, I have realized, as nobody else could have, with what zeal and devotion the members of the drafting committee, and especially its chairman, Dr. Ambedkar, in spite of his indifferent health, have worked. We could never make a decision which was or could be ever as right as when we put him on the drafting committee and made him its chairman. He has not only justified his selection, but has added luster to the work which he has done." Unquote. It is therefore abundantly clear, my friends, that Arun Shourie's criticism is entirely invalid, emanating as it does from some extraneous reasons which only he knows. There is not an iota of doubt that Dr. Ambedkar played a decisive and determining role in the shaping of India's constitution. Not only did Dr. Ambedkar redraft the committee's proposals, he followed them through the drafting committee and the Constituent Assembly to their logical end. Indeed, the most balanced view about Dr. Ambedkar's contribution came not from any congressman or any Indian leader. It came from Michael Brescia, who was Jawaharlal Nehru's biographer. He is the one who described Dr. Ambedkar as the chief architect of the Indian Constitution and as the field general of the campaign for a new constitution. Unquote. We did not even recognize Dr. Ambedkar as the principal architect of the Indian Constitution. It is the worldwide famous experts who understood, appreciated the work, gave him that title. It is so sad that because of his constant and enduring fights with Mahatma Gandhi, Congress party was never ever kind to him. And the way they treated him, not giving him Bharat Ratna for so long. Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar's Mahaparinirvan took place on 6th December 1956, but he got Bharat Ratna way later in 1990. And that too, when there was a non-Congress government, VP Singh's government was in power. How can you possibly explain this kind of apathy toward one of the finest leaders who laid the foundation of modern India in terms of being the father of Indian Constitution, and I dare say the father of India's Republic? Well, friends, we can conclude our session here. But before I leave, let me request you that if you like this podcast series, please like it, please share it, please subscribe to it, So long until we meet again real soon. Thank you. Namaskar.